It's great to welcome to the program today Sheri Berman, who's a professor of political science at Barnard College at Columbia University. Her most recent book is Democracy and Dictatorship in Europe, from the, and I hope I'm pronouncing it correctly, the Ancien Regime to the present day. Is that how it's said?
That's perfect.
Good. Okay. All right. So let's jump right into it. We've been talking a lot about social democracy in the context of what are the differences between that and democratic socialism. How does this compare to different types of capitalism? And one of the interesting areas of this is that much of sort of modern social democracy, socially democratic thought stems from early 20th century Sweden and the Social Democratic Party. And if we look today at Europe and what's going on, that model has actually changed significantly with the rise in right-wing nationalism in Europe and a lot of other changes that are taking place. So how would you, if someone just says to you, Sheri, how has the state of social democracy changed over the last 100 years in Europe? How would you generally characterize it?
Well, so there's lots of different ways to answer that question, which is never a good answer to a question. I mean, as far as the sort of status of parties that call themselves social democratic or would be seen as kind of center left, we have seen a dramatic decline in support for these parties over the late 20th and early 21st century. So one way to tell this story is to talk about the rise of these parties electorally, politically during the early 20th century, their sort of greatest electoral success after the Second World War, and then a decline that, again, has set in over the last decades. The other way to tell the story is by focusing less on how many votes they get and more on their ideas and how powerful those ideas have been. The traditionally or the sort of distinctive social democratic view is one that accepts capitalism, but is wary of it and believes that it is necessary for the democratic state to intervene in markets and in the economic sphere in general to sort of protect citizens from the most destructive and destabilizing consequences of markets. And again, if we're going to look at it that way, then one could say, starting in the beginning of the 20th century, social democrats within the left started fighting for this view against folks further to the left, Marxists, communists, democratic socialists. Only in Scandinavia and particularly in Sweden were these kinds of social democratic views able to triumph on the left during the interwar period. But after the Second World War, these type of views come to dominate mainstream center-left and social democratic parties, as well as, by the way, most other parties in Europe on the center and center-right. So this basic social democratic view that it was the task of democratic states to control capitalism, or rather to tame capitalism, to protect citizens. This was basically accepted across the board in Europe after the Second World War. But by the end of the 20th century, this consensus begins to fray and in fact becomes largely replaced by a more neoliberal consensus, which reigns, sort of up through, I would say, the financial and euro crisis. And now we're back again to an era when that consensus, that more neoliberal consensus, is being questioned. And we're again debating some fundamental questions about the relationship between democracy and capitalism, the correct role and scope for markets, things of that nature.
Is there, let me phrase it a different way. Are there places in Europe where, as a sort of idea labeled as social democracy, many of those ideas are just sort of mainstream, and as such, it's not as important that they be labeled in that way? So when you look at, for example, the healthcare systems of many European countries, the debate over, well, it's the social democrats who want one type of system, and they're pushing against everybody else who wants a sort of more American type system. Aren't a lot of those institutions now just kind of part of the baseline, and as such, they're no longer labeled as socially democratic?
So I think that is absolutely correct. Unlike in the United States, citizens in Europe since 1945 have come to take for granted a whole range of social protections that we are still fighting over here in the United States. And you mentioned the most obvious ones: universal health care, free education, a whole variety of other social protections that we do not have as a matter of citizenship here in the US. In that sense, a sort of social democratic view of the relationship between states and markets still reigns. But these kinds of systems have come under stress in Europe, and they have been changed, and they have changed fairly dramatically over the past decade. So while you still have a very extensive welfare state, for example, in Europe, and while in places like Sweden, you still have high levels of government spending, everybody expects healthcare, pensions, education, et cetera, to be given as a matter of course. You have seen significant privatization of many of these policies. You've seen rising inequality, and you've seen some deterioration around the edge in the kinds of commitments states have made to citizens. So yes, no, in Europe, it is generally accepted that welfare states are a good thing and that governments do need to provide social protection for citizens. But there has been an erosion of many of these policies, and more importantly, perhaps, many of the principles upon which they were predicated after the Second World War.
So in any election, there is always what we would call some level of defection. People who in a primary vote on one side and end up voting for, in the general election, for someone from a different party. There's defection of all kinds. But we have some data specifically that 12% of Bernie primary voters in 2016 ended up voting for Donald Trump. Now, they were, you can argue, balanced out by some, Ted Cruz voters who ended up voting for Hillary Clinton. But to focus in specifically for the purpose of our conversation on those 12%, is that a phenomenon that is also identifiable in Europe, where European social democrats and folks more aligned with the ideology of Bernie Sanders get sort of swept up in some of these populist right-wing movements or in the nationalism and end up supporting that? Or is that not a dynamic you've observed in Europe?
So the answer to your question, again, is yes and no.
Okay.
I mean, if you look at any American election, the candidate in the primaries the supporters of primary candidates who lose, some percentage of them always defect to the other party. So the 12% of Bernie Sanders voters who defected to Trump is not out of line with the number of Clinton supporters who defected after Clinton lost to Obama. But the larger point that you raise is a very important one. The defection of lower educated and working class white voters from the Democratic Party to the Republican Party, and particularly to Trump in 2016. This is a broader phenomenon that we have seen in Europe. In fact, in many European countries now, it is not social democratic parties, but right-wing populist parties that are the largest working class parties in their party systems. That is to say, more workers, people in the working class, support right-wing populist parties in many European countries, including France and Austria, than they do social democratic parties. So the broader phenomenon, right, of folks defecting from the left, particularly again among the working class and people with lower educational levels, to the populist right, this is a profoundly important and destabilizing phenomenon that you can see on both sides of the Atlantic.
In the book, sort of related to this, one of the things you talk about are countries in Europe that have formed, I guess what we would call liberal Western democracies in the last several hundred years, and that at different points in time and for different reasons, there's sort of a backsliding that happens towards autocracy, towards authoritarianism. What are the more common reasons, if there are unifying or common reasons that happens, or are they really unique cases?
Well, there's lots of reasons why they happen. And I think it is important, given how worried we are about the state of democracy today, to point out that we still have more democracies in the world today than ever before, and that we've had less backsliding after the wave of democratization that began in the late 20th century with the collapse of the Soviet Union than we have during previous democratic waves. So those would be waves in 1848, after the First World War, after the Second World War. So overall, the state of democracy is still quite strong. But for countries that do backslide, in places where democracy does decay, if not collapse, there are definitely some patterns that we should be wary of, because in the past they have led to, again, significant problems with democracy. Social polarization, which of course is something we are constantly talking about here in the US. This is very problematic because it makes democracy almost impossible to function. People see their opponents as illegitimate rather than just as opponents. They find it very difficult to compromise and bargain, which of course is what democracy requires. Every political battle becomes zero sum. And so it's very difficult to have well-functioning democracies in the kinds of situations where you have social polarization, parties are pushed further to the extreme, that kind of thing. In general, if we think about the sort of period when democracy, quote unquote, worked best in the West, that is to say, after the Second World War, when we got stable, well-functioning democracies in Western Europe, as well as obviously well-functioning democracy here in the United States, we should also remember that this was a period with very particular social and economic characteristics as well. We had rising growth. Europe grew the fastest it's ever grown in its entire history in the 30 years after 1945. And along with that growth came incredible equalization of incomes and wealth. Again, greater equalization than had ever occurred before. And this is important because it helped to diminish divisions in society. It helped to create the sense that the democratic system could deliver for everyone, that the gains of one group did not come at the expense of the others, and that politicians and parties were responsive to the needs of their citizens. Of course, we all know that these kinds of developments changed dramatically in the late 20th century when growth slowed, unemployment rose, particularly in Europe. Inequality skyrocketed in the United States in particular, but in almost all European countries as well. And we began to see, again, greater divisions within Western societies, all of which were accompanied by dramatic social and demographic change, which only complicated the process of democratic politics even more.
Absolutely fascinating stuff. And I think anybody who has listened to our conversation can tell that there is a lot to be gleaned from the history of Europe in terms of what we are starting to see in some ways in the United States today. The book is Democracy and Dictatorship in Europe, from the Ancien Regime to the Present Day. We've been speaking with the book's author, Barnard College professor Sheri Berman. Sheri, really a pleasure having you on.
Thank you so much. I was really glad to have this conversation.